The 3rd century AD in Sipan, in northern Peru. A powerful Mochica ruler has died. The funerary rites are marked by the people's mourning. He has been embalmed together with his ornaments and sacred emblems of gold, silver, and precious stones, which he will keep using in the afterlife. "1,700 years later, in the spring of 1987, the Peruvian archaeologist Walter Alba discovered his tomb in the pyramid at Huacarrajada. The news traveled around the globe. It was the richest burial site in the Americas and the first ever found belonging to a Moche ruler. The international scientific community was amazed by the subtlety and exquisiteness of the gold and silver work and the methods employed in working the metals. The Mochica people showed themselves to be an advanced civilization in terms of technology and social organization. From that moment on, the researchers began to rewrite the history of the Americas. The Moche rulers were considered demigods. They were half human, half divine. No one dared to look them in the eye. When they passed by, the fearful people prostrated themselves. They were worshipped and revered at all times. The Mochica people, or Moches, lived on the northern coast of Peru, between the sea and the Andes, one of the most arid places on the planet, from the 1st to the 6th centuries AD. Their influence spread almost to modern Ecuador to the north, and to the Guarmey Valley to the south. In the lands where they lived, they left behind the remains of temples, pyramids, palaces, fortifications, and irrigation canals. Their artistic legacy speaks to us of a creative and lively people, made up of farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and warriors who managed to tame the desert. February of 1987. The tomb raider Ernil Bernal and his gang loot an extremely rich burial site in the Huacarrajada pyramid. 20 years later, Teófilo Villanueva, one of the members of his gang, describes those events for the first time ever to José Manuel Novoa, the director of this documentary.
I went in and we took out a mask, a glass, a portrait of someone. And
in gold?
In gold. Then we went outside, hugged each other, and we went home afraid.
Did you leave the treasure there that night?
Yeah, we left it all there.
You didn't keep digging?
To get up courage, I drank 2 glasses of rum, went into the pit, and with the rod, got some things.
With the same one we have here?
Yes, I got some things with a hook, and I couldn't get them all.
There were so many things you couldn't do it all by yourself.
Too many, I didn't know what to take. There were things of all sizes. The owner of the things was in the middle, and the things were placed around him.
The owner of the things was a man who looked like the Lord of Sipan.
Yeah, the man had ornaments on both sides of him, and in the middle was the sarcophagus. We took 2 more cups, and we went to his house that night scared. We returned the next day at about 8 in the evening. I opened up a hole about 50 centimeters wide, and the owner of the things was all covered from head to toe with all the things made of gold.
These extraordinary artifacts are part of the loot they took. The police found them when they searched Ernil Bernal's house a few days later. The general in charge of the district headquarters called Walter Alba and asked him to examine them.
When I reached the police station, the general showed me these artifacts of unequaled artistic quality. I had no doubt that an important tomb had just been looted at Sipan. We had to take action immediately.
When he arrived at Sipan, Walter was astounded. The desecrated tomb was enormous. All he found was an impressive copper scepter that the looters had miraculously missed. Was this a sign that there were more intact tombs?
When we arrived here in February of 1987, the site was full of people. Dozens of locals were digging in search of whatever the looters had left behind days before.
That very day, Walter took charge of the archaeological site. What he didn't know then was that he was just beginning to explore the Mochica's most important sacred burial ground. This is what Huaca Rajada was like in its time. 88 million adobe bricks were needed to build it. The most important men of the time were buried here. Every night, they heard gunfire. Every day, Walter Alba and his small team of assistants defended the archaeological site from the attacks of the looters. During another raid, the police accidentally killed Ernil Bernal. The attacks were stepped up. The archaeologists were under siege, but they kept working. A few days later, they found a small sealed chamber with more than 1,000 clay pots and the skeleton of a warrior. Could he have been a guard? There could be little doubt that he was protecting something very important. Then they discovered a section containing a large intact tomb and the remains of a wooden sarcophagus. Walter was about to live an unforgettable experience.
When we began to inspect the interior of the coffin and raise some earth among the sediments, a miniature face in gold appeared and seemed to stare me right in the eye. It was an eternal instant that I will never forget.
It was a gold and turquoise earring worn by a Moche ruler they called the Lord of Sipan. The discovery took place on the 26th of July, 1987. Never before had anyone found such an important tomb. The archaeologists were standing over an unidentifiable mass of gold and oxidized copper objects that made up the Lord's funerary bundle. They had to save this heritage of humanity and give it back its splendor. The recovery and restoration of each of the ornaments and emblems took close to 8 months. More than 600 objects made of gold, silver, gold-plated copper, seashells, precious stones, and fabrics formed the Lord of Sipan's funerary bundle, a faithful reflection of his splendor in life.
We are inside an exact replica of the tomb, just as we found it in 1987. Then we were able to find in the center the coffin of the Lord, which contained the ornaments, clothing, and emblems that he used when he was alive. To the right lies the military chief with his metallic ornaments. To the left, the standard bearer. And at his feet and his head, the three young women who were buried with him in reed coffins to accompany him on his journey to eternity. None of them had yet reached the age of 20 when they were buried with the Lord. Under the side coffins were the skeletons of two llamas, which were the first animals to be sacrificed. In a corner, there were the bones of a child. And on both sides, in 4 niches, there were 212 pottery vessels that represented warriors, prisoners, or personages praying. The skeleton of a dog lay on the coffin of the standard bearer. And finally, the wooden roof that originally covered the funerary chamber. On the roof lay the skeleton of the guardian of the tomb, whose feet had been cut off. And here, in another niche, there was a guard who was also given the job of protecting this funerary chamber.
The Mochicas believed in transcendence, in life after death, and that is why they were buried together with everything they owned. Important personages were even accompanied on their final journey into the afterlife by servants, wives, concubines, and guards. But were they buried alive, or were they buried after being sacrificed?
The bodies were carefully prepared and buried in reed coffins, a fact that definitely demonstrates to us that whether they were sacrificed voluntarily or not, these people were already dead when they were interred. This is where the mortal remains of the Lord of Sipan lie. It was a challenge for us to preserve and recover these bones, both for the importance of the information they contained and for their historical significance. Thanks to the forensic studies, we now know that the Lord of Sipan died when he was between 45 and 55 years old, and that he had enjoyed excellent health, except for an incipient arthritis in the spinal column. He was 1.67 meters tall, or 5'6", which was pretty tall for the time. He wasn't very muscular, which proves that he didn't carry out any physical work. The important personages were always carried around on litters. His teeth were also still in excellent shape, which shows us that there was a special diet reserved for the important men of the elite.
Walter Alba and his 2 close collaborators, Lucho Chero and his wife Susana Meneses, discovered 12 more tombs of important members of the hierarchy on the same funerary platform at Sipan. The most important belonged to the priest and the so-called Old Lord of Sipan, the oldest ruler found so far. His funerary bundle is spectacular. They look like lunar landscapes or one filled with bomb craters. Each hole corresponds to a looted tomb. The thievery in archaeological sites continues. Every night, the gangs of huaqueros, as the tomb raiders are called in Peru, steal part of Peru's archaeological heritage. The tombs are broken open with pickaxes and shovels. Then the information that they could have revealed is lost forever. They toss the mummies out in the open, interrupting their eternal rest with no respect for the ancestral beliefs about the afterlife. In the northern region of Lambayeque, we find strange hills devoid of any vegetation. They are not natural features of the landscape. They are moche structures worn down by time and the weather. This is what the Pampa Grande Pyramid looked like. It's a titanic work that required more than 122 million adobe bricks to build. A city that eventually was home to some 15,000 inhabitants grew up around it. It may have been the most important administrative and political center of the Moche people. The Mochicas were great builders. They created adobe constructions of surprising size for the period. Truncated pyramids, platforms, large precincts, squares, and access ramps formed part of their important religious centers. Each family or clan contributed a certain number of adobe bricks to the construction work. We can see a mark or family seal on the bricks that identifies them. The temples grew as additions were built. The facades were covered by successive renovations. Then they were plastered, painted red or yellow, and decorated with polychrome reliefs representing gods, mythical scenes, or religious ceremonies. They built large structures with blocks joined by slip joints to absorb the movements caused by earthquakes. The pyramids housed the prayer halls and sacrificial altars, the rooms where the Lord and the priests lived, and the reception and council halls where the nobles and military chiefs met. When a council was held, the temple acolytes dusted the floors with cinnabar so that the Lord would not step directly on the floor. Mercury sulfide, also called cinnabar, was a sacred substance used in religious ceremonies and to anoint cadavers. He always came in accompanied by his military chief. The acolytes helped him to sit down by holding up his coxal or hip protectors, one made of gold and the other of silver. The Lord bore his main ornaments, the crown that symbolized the mysterious shamanic flight, the scepter of power, a large gold nose ring which hid any facial expression from view, and the necklace of gold and silver peanuts which referred to the cycle of life. The gold and silver signified the eternal duality, the sun and the moon, day and night, life and death. This was a very hierarchical society. Beneath the Lord came the religious authorities, then the military chiefs and the nobles. Craftsmen also enjoyed special status. The weavers were highly respected. The Mochicas developed textile workshops to produce clothing, blankets, and ornaments. They grew large quantities of cotton in a unique variety of natural colors, white, brown, reddish, and purple, that still exists in Peru today. It's early May 2007. Today is a very special day for Walter Alba and his team of archaeologists. 7 years earlier, the excavations at Huacarrajada were stopped due to a lack of funds. Today they are beginning again, and they have great expectations.
Here, 7 years ago, on the funerary platform, the digging on a tomb was left incomplete. It was a funerary chamber located right where I'm standing. We don't know who was buried here, but we hope it was a warrior, a military chief, someone important in the court of the lords of Sipan.
In just a few days, they have excavated to the same level of the tomb as in the year 2000. A deposit of offerings has appeared, suggesting that an important person is buried there. We're going to experience this exciting discovery step by step. Peru's northern coast is a desert where it seems impossible to live. And yet it was the birthplace of enigmatic civilizations like the Moche, which amaze the world today. Periodically, this region is devastated by the El Niño phenomenon. Normally, the clouds pushed by the wind drop their rain on the Andean mountains. But every so often, when a warm current called El Niño reaches the coast, there are torrential rains both on the coast and in the mountains, causing terrible catastrophes. The rivers flow to the sea loaded with silt, which the waves, and later the wind, deposit on the desert again, forming dunes and sandy areas that cover the land and constructions. The Mochicas attributed the arrival of El Niño to the anger of the gods, which is why they made constant offerings and human sacrifices. Their deities were related to nature, had the attributes of totemic animals, and lived in valleys, the mountains, rivers, or the sea, like the god of the ocean depths, represented by the devilfish. But above them all was powerful Ayapaec with his feline face. Those who were sacrificed usually had their throats cut or were thrown off the sacred mountains. Sometimes their skulls were smashed with a war club. The nobles who voluntarily offered to be sacrificed cut their jugular veins and bled to death. The human sacrifices of the Mochicas were never as numerous as those carried out by the Mayas, who were their contemporaries. The greatest number of human offerings were made when the oracles predicted the arrival of the El Niño phenomenon. But normally, there were only a few sacrifices intended to make the soil fertile. It was always an honor to be sacrificed. Sometimes families would offer their virgin daughters to the great Ayapaec. Under the hallucinogenic effects of the San Pedro cactus, the girls would voluntarily throw themselves off the cliffs. The priests indicated the need for sacrifices after consulting the gods. In the murals in the ceremonial patio at the Huaca de la Luna, we can see numerous stars that represent the San Pedro cactus, the means they use to communicate with the other world. It is the cactus of the gods. The main alkaloid in the San Pedro cactus is mescaline, a hallucinatory drug that causes altered states of consciousness and deep trances when it is consumed. In the temple dedicated to the owl goddess, the Mochica priestess presides over the ceremonies in which the San Pedro cactus, perhaps the oldest magical plant in South America, is consumed. During the ritual, the priestess was freed from the material world and traveled through the cosmic regions to the abode of the great god Ayapaec. While still young girls, the novices at the temple were initiated in the shamanic flights. A certain sense of dizziness gave way to a sharpening of the senses, a heightened vision of reality. Finally, they began the flight. They were transported through time, matter, and distance. The new tomb may have been looted. They have discovered a Huaqueros pit going down parallel to the south wall. They've worked hard to clarify the situation as quickly as possible. Miraculously, the tomb raiders missed the algarobo beams that sealed the funerary chamber by just 20 centimeters or 8 inches. The tomb is intact. They're going to make an important discovery. They will have to stand guard at the camp day and night.
We saw that there was a tomb raiders pit there on the northwestern side. We followed it for a while and saw that it stops just 20 centimeters from the algarobo beams that form the lid. And at the bottom we found some Dunlop shoes size 38.
But, well, those worries are over.
In the morning, there is a lot of activity. They begin to speculate about the identity of the person they are about to disinter. They are filled with optimism. Under the direction of Lucho Chero, they gather samples for the carbon dating tests, which will tell them how old the tomb is. Archaeological work is being carried out all over the pyramid. Never have such extensive excavations been carried out as those at Huacarrajada. They have discovered 20 Chimu burial sites, which indicates that this place continued to be considered sacred long after the decline of the Mochica. Among the workers, who are almost all from the village of Sipan, we find a special character who demonstrates once again that life is unpredictable. He is Teófilo Villanueva, who we see pushing the wheelbarrow of Unit 4. He is the Huaquero who told us about how they entered the tomb that was raided 20 years ago. Like others who used to raid the tombs, today he works for Walter Alba. They know that these digs and the museum being built in connection with the site will bring many visitors, and that will be very important for them and for the village. After sketching the algarobo beams, they penetrate the funerary chamber. The dry woods are like oases in the Peruvian desert. The algarobo is the predominant species. Its wood has always been used because of its hardness and durability. The impetuous rivers that are born in the Andes reach the arid lands of the coast after carving abrupt landscapes and canyons, like those of the Santa River. The Mochicas knew how to make use of these resources. Thanks to their knowledge of canal building and irrigation techniques, they turned these dry lands into a green paradise, which meant moving hundreds of thousands of tons of earth, hydraulic works which still haven't been surpassed, and which made it possible to farm twice the amount of land that is farmed today in the same valleys. They fertilized the fields with guano gathered from the islands. Their main crop was corn, according to recent research, a genetic invention that was the fruit of the botanical experiments of the ancient American cultures. They also lived facing the sea. Fish and shellfish were a part of their daily diet. The fishermen living along the coast represented a separate world, far from the big cities and the ceremonial and administrative centers. With their reed boats, called caballitos de totora, or bulrush horses, which are still used today by Peruvian fishermen, they ventured into the sea to fish. They rode the breakers to reach the schools of fish. The religious processions periodically came down to the beach to collect seashells. They considered them sacred. They ground them to obtain the white powder that they used in their offerings. At sundown, the fishermen returned with their catch. These fishermen may have been the precursors of surfing 2,000 years ago. Using larger boats, also built with bulrushes, they sailed to the far-off islands of Ecuador to collect spondylus shells, which were considered sacred. Since time immemorial, shells have been an object of worship, proof of which is this marvelous product of the Chabin culture. The shells were used to make the breastplates of warriors and nobles. We still don't know how they managed to drill their tiny cylindrical beads.
Tareistacha'ine da chipa, iachek jos nem amficho.
Oh, imasek.
Chob san kaktim mai. Seistim menchek ayapek nik, eigen nem amficho.
At the bottom of the tomb, they can clearly perceive the shape of a large sarcophagus, which measures 1 meter 30 centimeters wide by 2 meters long, which is almost the same size as that of the Lord of Sipan. But soon something happens that dampens Luchochero's spirits. It looks like there are 2 coffins, which means that the tomb is not as important as they thought, although they can see a strange mark in the ground. Unlike the majority of the pre-Incan cultures, the Mochicas did not bury their dead in the fetal position. The simplest burial sites correspond to peasants, and they are barely wrapped in a blanket and buried in a simple grave. Others contain some offerings and are wrapped up for protection and placed in rectangular tombs of adobe or stone. Those of highest rank are placed in elaborate coffins and chambers with niches for the numerous offerings. Each tomb reflects the job and social class of the person buried in it. This morning, they carried out ceremonies to give the earth its due. The workers are afraid of the so-called mal de huaca, or tomb sickness, a superstition in which the powerful spirits that live in these pyramids possess the lives of those who desecrate their secrets. They make an offering to the Pachamama, the goddess of the earth, for her to give them courage and to protect them. And there is very good news. There is only 1 coffin. What looked like a partition between 2 coffins is really the central lid of the sarcophagus, which when the algaroba beams broke under the weight of the earth placed on top of them, took this shape. The archaeologists are filled with optimism again. In addition, the first pottery offerings have appeared. The Mochica did not have writing, but captured their world on the iconography on their pottery. This graphic language documents their surroundings and ideas and describes all sorts of events in their lives. Through their pottery, archaeologists and researchers have managed to decipher the singular differences that defined their ancient culture. The pottery used in the homes of the Moche was functional and simple and had little decoration. They did not use any kind of potter's wheel. They made their pottery manually with the use of a spatula, a technique which is still used today in some towns in the north of the country. The pottery destined for decoration or for ritual use was made with molds. Once the clay had been mixed and kneaded, it was distributed uniformly in the mold. Soon after it had dried, the piece was taken out, retouched, perfected, and polished. Then it was fired, which was carried out in open kilns. Men, gods, animals, plants, and complex ritual scenes were depicted by the artists who exploited 2 main artistic manifestations, sculpture and painting. The Mochica's artwork is amazing for its expressivity and perfection. They are true portraits in clay, comparable to the sculptures of the classical world. Thanks to their pottery, we know that the Mochicas used face and body paints that represented the social status and clan of the person wearing them. They were also used in various ceremonies or to mark certain actions. The process to produce them began with a sculpture, from which they obtained 2 molds of each half. Practically all the characters are represented in their pottery, from musicians and farmers to anthropomorphic gods like the crab god. Almost all the potter's work was destined to become offerings that accompanied the dead. The erotic figurines are also famous, and once again they demonstrate the level of cultural development reached by the Mochicas. According to the quantity of pottery found at the archaeological sites, the pottery workshops must have had a lot of people working in them to produce so much. The first works of oxidized gold-plated copper begin to appear. The atmosphere at the dig is electric. Silence reigns, as well as absolute respect for the personage about to be exhumed. A feline head bodes well for the importance of the tomb. On the corpse's chest, a large V-shaped crown appears, which sheds some light on his identity. Slowly, with the use of fine brushes and spatulas, the ornaments that he used in life appear. There is a strong presence in the waka, something mysterious and ethereal.
We are looking at the first layer of the recently discovered tomb, a set of ornaments and emblems. In the lower part, we are surprised to find 3 club heads that have been taken off their handles, intentionally crushed, and placed in this section of the tomb. Either they were weapons that he used when he was alive, or they were trophies taken in ritual combat. So we're talking about 3 victories in combat.
The ritual combats are similar in some ways to the medieval tournaments among knights. But here the loser almost never died during the fight. If he lost his headgear, that was enough to end the combat. The winner tied the loser's weapons to his war club and stripped him. He put a noose around his neck and led him before the Lord. Then he was sacrificed. Wooden clubs covered with copper were the Mochica's main weapon. It weighed about 5 kilos, or 11 pounds, and dealt a crushing blow to the adversary. They also used knives and spears, which were thrown with slings to increase their power and distance. From childhood, Mochica boys gradually went through a series of varied initiation rites that decided their future. The initiation process marked the end of adolescence. Then a ritual race was held. The winner went on to form part of the Lord's personal guard. Each participant was given a bag full of payares, seeds that the oracles used to make their predictions. At the end of the race, and as part of the final phase of initiation, the diviners read their payares.
Amechia, Theich man Chile Chuna mi Kerkolen, Josenen men man Theich.
Seik. Chimminche que mote sek. Le tsunami kerkol.
Fupan. Eis. Tu hedas ayen molun. New chalot testek meilan. Temnein menyo chan si amner lemiserna. Fupan chang falpir. Chepang mochach. Chang has tono amechek.
Six gold-plated copper feline heads have appeared. The discovery may turn out to be extremely important. Walter and Lucho believe that he is the fourth personage represented in the Moche iconography, the one they know nothing about so far. How is it possible that the Mochicas knew how to gold-plate copper, something that was only made possible in Europe in the late 18th century thanks to the process of electrolysis? However they did it, they managed to achieve this 1,900 years ago. They now have definite confirmation. The tomb belongs to the fourth personage in the presentation iconography. The one who could be the Lord of Sipan receives the sacrificial chalice from the priest. Behind them is the priestess, and further back is the new personage drawn the same size as the Lord. We still know very little about him, only that he was of the highest rank and that he carried out military and religious duties. Lucho Chero takes the largest artifacts out of the tomb to begin their restoration. They have to continue digging down to recover the bones. The restoration work will take months. The restoration specialists join and glue together the pieces, which sometimes are heavily deteriorated, as if they were the pieces of a puzzle. With the aid of a scalpel, they gradually separate the layers of copper oxide to reveal the gold plating. These artifacts will be put on display at the Archaeological Sites Museum, located at the dig itself, as will the artifacts that emerge from future finds. The Mochica's mastery of metalworking is surprising. They employed copper intensively to make tools, weapons, and ornaments. The ore extracted from the mines was ground on mills to break it into small pieces before putting it in the ovens. At the silversmiths' workshops, they worked on everything from the production of the metals to actually making the ornaments. The small pieces of metal were melted and blended with charcoal in clay ovens. The fire was stoked with reed blowers finished with clay nozzles to achieve a temperature of a little over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The silversmiths made thin sheets of metal by reheating the metal again and again. They then shaped the pieces by hammering them into molds. They also stamped images into the metal and finished the pieces by cutting, hammering, retouching, and polishing them. Then they were assembled to form different objects. If their gold-plating copper with electrochemical processes astounds us, with methods similar to those used today, we can be no less impressed by their managing to solder metals. Blowing through a tiny tube, they managed to concentrate the flame and raise the temperature enough to be able to solder metal. They finally reached the bones. They put the most important reconstructed artifacts back where they were to get an overall vision of the burial site. With the greatest of respect, the noble's skeleton is removed from his tomb. On either side of the sarcophagus have appeared the bones of a woman, possibly a concubine, and the skeleton of a sacrificed llama. Another member of the Moche elite has been recovered for posterity. We are watching what could have been the funerary rites of the Lord of Sipan. The people are in mourning. In the palace patio, the Lord's body will be prepared for his final journey. Nobles, military chiefs, counselors, oracles, and priests keep watch over his body while the people mourn their loss. At the foot of the funerary mound, the people leave offerings to be placed in his tomb. For several days, the Lord's embalmed body will be displayed so that everyone can make farewell offerings. The highest-ranking members of the temple lead the funeral rites and the embalming process. An acolyte applies makeup to the Lord's face with sacred cinnabar as a priest watches attentively.
Hianchek Jos, Ajungese Nergob Amduni Chek Changchar, Siansia Moshisek Tokna.
Each ornament or emblem is put in its place following rites conceived so that, in the afterlife, his rank as ruler and his divine essence will be evident. When he reaches the home of the gods, the great god Ayapaik will recognize him easily. Some of those present, like the standard bearer or the military chief, know that they have come to the end of their days. It will be an honor for them to accompany the Lord on his journey. They will proudly immolate themselves at the end of his funeral and will then be buried alongside him. The priest places the funerary mask on him. He covers his eyes, nose, and mouth with sheets of gold and buckles on his chin piece. His face disappears forever from this world. It is the crowning moment of the funeral. The mourners cry inconsolably as they bid him farewell. A mass of molten metal is placed in each hand, gold in the right hand and silver in the left.
Ninsek Yangero, Los Katen Singo Poinen Magetinsa.
Inententek Anames Kismire.
The music continues, solemn and sad. The funeral wind instruments sound like the growling of an extraordinary being, a howl from the other world that announces the transmutation of his soul. Walter Alva, moved at the sight of these scenes, captured his feelings in writing and drew up the epitaph for this recreation and the epilogue of this documentary. I feel that our paths crossed at a moment of history. The Lord existed beyond his physical death when it fell to me to save him from being looted and bring him into the present. Today I ask myself if it was destiny or part of the plan of the Mochica gods. I watch this recreation of his funeral, and I feel a deep and contained emotion. I am profoundly moved, as if I were bidding a friend farewell forever. The fact is that I was given the honor and privilege of introducing the world to the splendor of his culture.